Events start with really great catering professionals. TastyCatering.com.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Intersectionality and identity politics is so exhausting, isn't it? Forces everything to be viewed through a racial and political and identity privilege, even the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral. Give you an example. She's not the only one, but she's a good example of the response from one quarter. Cincinnati Councilwoman Tamaya Dennard on Twitter saying the Notre Dame Cathedral fire coverage is a, quote, prime example of privilege, unquote. She pointed to the recent string of arsons at predominantly black churches in Louisiana as an example. I'm sure they held significance as well. They were barely acknowledged, the black churches in Louisiana.
Clearly she doesn't see the historical differences between the two situations.
Well, and she also apparently doesn't read the New York Times because it was front page coverage on the New York Times of the black church arsons, and other national media outlets covered the story as well. Perhaps they didn't have, those churches didn't have the historical significance of the 850-year-old cathedral that the entire world saw burning in real time, sort of to punctuate it. But the idea that you have to compare one to the other, they're both terrible events. One is apparently a criminal event, the arsons at these black churches, and money's being raised to rebuild those black churches in Louisiana, just as it is the cathedral in Paris.
Well, because of the Notre Dame church fire, people on Twitter started a GoFundMe page. $966,000 has been raised so far
for the black churches.
For the black churches, yep.
Right.
And somebody has been charged with arson for setting fire to those three churches. So it got more attention, I believe, personally, because of the Notre Dame fire.
Perhaps. I mean, just the idea that this is a comparison contrast is just so tiresome to me. I'm too exhausted even to talk about it anymore, which is why we have David French on. David French, writer at National Review, contributor to Time Magazine, constitutional lawyer, author, veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He's written on the cathedral fire as well. David, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So, I mean, before we get to the cathedral and its merits and its implications, what about this? Because it's not just the Cincinnati councilwoman that has made this point.
Yeah, I mean, come on. Notre Dame is an 800-year-old iconic building in not just in Western civilization, although it is in Western civilization, in the world. Mm-hmm. This would be about like watching somebody blow up the pyramids. I mean, the pyramids are older, of course, but I mean, that's the magnitude of the building that we're talking about. And it's not just an iconic building for Western civilization. It's an iconic house of worship for the Catholic Church and for really all Christians. It's really extraordinary that anyone would even think to make this comparison. And Amy's right. I mean, already now the number on the GoFundMe that Yashar Ali set up has blown through $1 million for the churches in Louisiana. They are getting more attention right now, in part because of the Notre Dame burning. And I think that there should be more than $1 million raised. I donated to the cause to rebuild these churches in the South. It was a horrible thing that happened. But, when you have an 800-year-old iconic symbol of the Catholic Church and of Western civilization burning in the heart of one of the world's great cities, I'm sorry, that's a world historical event. It is. And to say otherwise is just ludicrous.
Well, you wrote in your article in National Review about your experience in Notre Dame, and can you explain it to us?
Yes, I was. It was March 9th, 1996. I remember it very well because it was my wedding day, and I was getting married in France. And I remember that morning I went into Notre Dame and prayed there, prayed for my marriage, for my wife, for the kids we hope to have. And I remember just being so incredibly touched and overwhelmed by the sense that, I was kneeling in the same place where millions of other Christians had knelt in the centuries that had come before me. And it was one of the first times in my life. I'm not Catholic, I'm Protestant. I'd grown up in churches that were very plain. Sometimes they didn't even have a cross in them. They were so plain. And I remember really for the first time in my life feeling that sense of connection to the historical church. And I immediately thought about that as I saw those flames. And so many other people so many other people were sharing their memories of Notre Dame, that, even if it was just a quick visit as a tourist or somebody had gone there and worshiped there. And it was touching to see those recollections. And as it burned, we thought it was just going to be gone forever. I mean, I expected to wake up the next morning and there just be skeletal remains. But now it looks like they'll be able to rebuild, and I just hope they don't screw that up.
Yeah, no kidding. Right. And Macron's really put a marker down when he says it's going to be more beautiful than ever. He gets a pretty tall bar. But I wanted to get your reaction, though, too. I mean, this happening during Holy Week, this happening at a time of increased secularization in the West. In fact, Ryan Burge, a political scientist at Eastern Illinois University and a Baptist pastor, put out a survey finding that, per his research, 2,000 people interviewed, no religion is now, for the first time, eclipsed any denominational affiliation. 23% of his respondents, no religion, Catholics at 20, just under that, and evangelicals at 22.5%. What are the implications of the increased secularization of the West?
Yeah, I was talking about this on my podcast, and people were saying that there was, that the church burning was a symbol of the decline of faith. It was sort of symbolic of the decline of faith in France. And I'm thinking, well, if that was the case, it would have burned 100 years ago. I mean, France has been secular for a really long time, and so I don't know that it was symbolic of anything like that. But I do think, the burning of the church has caused a period of reflection, and it's caused a lot of grief. And sometimes in reflection and grief, we can sort of truths can hit home in a different way. And I do think, particularly in Western Europe, what you're seeing is a society that is in large part lost connection to its historic faith. Here in the U.S., the picture is a little bit different. Here in the U.S., it's more like we're beginning to have, instead of a loss of faith, we're having two groups growing. We're actually having the nuns, those people who have no particular connection to a church, who are growing very quickly. But who else is also growing are evangelicals. And so America is moving much more towards a nation that is becoming both more faithful in some ways and more secular in some ways. The kind of group of people who are falling into one camp or the other are the people who are sort of more nominally Christian, the people who are the occasional churchgoer. Those folks are kind of vanishing, and they're either going into the evangelical ranks with the more committed churchgoer, or they're sort of falling out of religion entirely. And it's creating fascinating divisions in American society because these people are not evenly spaced out.
Right. Well, why do you think certain politicians are vilified for their Christianity? Because I think of Mike Pence and his wife, and they're lovely Christian people, but people see that as taboo or as wrong.
Well, one of the first things you have to realize, and you guys know this very, very well, is the elite media is far more secular than the rest of the United States. Mm-hmm. And so they're going to look at a Karen Pence or a Mike Pence and they don't get them. They don't understand them. They're outside of their experience.
They're scared of them even.
Oh, to the extent that they know or understand or like Christianity, it's more the Pete Buttigieg kind. It's the mainline Episcopalian, social justice oriented Christianity that's kind of going away, honestly. And they're much more comfortable with that. That's what they're. To the extent they have encounters with Christians, that's the encounters they have. And Mike and Karen Pence, that's the Christianity of the heartland. It's not really the Christianity that they're all that connected to. And you're right. Not only they dislike it, they often fear it.
And it twists them in knots, doesn't it? I mean, you can't help over the last several weeks compare the ridicule that Mike Pence was subjected to when it was reported that he doesn't have dinner with a woman unless his wife is present, to ridicule, joke. Oh, he lives in footloose land and so on and so forth. And then the rush to defend Joe Biden's creepiness as just a man who is affectionate and touchy-feely, and this is much ado about nothing. Had it been Mike Pence who was smelling people's hair and rubbing interns' shoulders, how would that have been treated by those same media elites you described?
Oh, they would have treated it as creepy and weird, and probably some sort of evidence of the cult-like weirdo nature of his Christianity. I mean, there's no telling the kind of think pieces you'd see. But it's funny that all that controversy over the Pence rules has faded a little bit in the aftermath of the Me Too scandals. I mean, it feels like 100 years ago that people were arguing about the Pence rules, and then along comes the Harvey Weinstein triggered avalanche of accusations all across media, all across Hollywood, all across academia, and now suddenly sort of a much more prudential kind of policy looks to make sense to some people, especially when all kinds of women came forward and said that Mike Pence has always been a perfect gentleman and has given me opportunities to succeed in a career that I never would have otherwise had. And so it looks a little bit different now, doesn't it?
It does indeed. David French, writer at National Review, nationalreview.com. Catch his latest piece on the cathedral. Contributor to Time, constitutional lawyer, best-selling author, and veteran of Operation Iraqi Freedom. David, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.